Welcome to the program today. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. Donors have been pledging millions to helping Ukraine with whatever it needs and have rounded off the figure so far to $6.5 billion. The event, co-hosted by Poland and Sweden in cooperation with the EU, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel in attendance. We'll return to this in a bit. But staying with another development in the war, Russian gas giant Gazprom today announced it will use the onshore capacity of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline for Russia's domestic needs. Posting on Telegram earlier, Gazprom says this is due to the phase that the pipeline is currently not in use, so it has decided to use the gas to supply the northwestern regions of Russia. Nord Stream 2 is a 1,200-kilometer pipeline under the Baltic Sea, which was designed to take gas from the Russian coast near St. Petersburg to Lubmin in Germany. Back in February, Germany suspended the proofs of giving the pipeline between it and Russia an operating license, effectively stopping the project until further notice. In the meantime, political advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky, Oleksiy Arestovich, says Ukraine is unlikely to launch a counter-offensive against Russia before mid-June, when it hopes to receive more weapons from allies. He also says he does not expect Russia's offensive in Ukraine to produce any significant results by Russia's so-called Victory Day on the 9th of May, when it celebrates defeating Nazi Germany in World War II. He also says fighting is ongoing at the Azovstal steelworks plant, where Ukrainian fighters and some civilians are holed up in the city of Mariupol. Meanwhile, happening in Europe today, leaders, we mentioned the donors' conference to raise funds still ongoing to help Ukraine.
Serbia supports the activities under...
Thank you for all the pledges. I have just received the final number, and I'm very glad to announce that all of us managed to mobilize $6.5 billion. These are pledges which were put, and thank you.
Romania took the initiative of liberalizing transport conditions for Ukrainian exports, especially for agricultural products. These measures allow Ukraine to continue exporting essential agricultural output, thus mitigating the volatility and disruption of international markets while generating much-needed income for our Ukrainian neighbors.
Serbia supports the activities undertaken by the United Nations and the international humanitarian actors to urgently address the needs of the most vulnerable categories affected by the conflict. And for that reason, I take this opportunity to pledge 3 million euros from Serbia for the humanitarian response in Ukraine.
And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson today hosted his Japanese counterpart at number 10 Downing Street, where both held bilateral talks. Mr. Fumio Kishida, who became Prime Minister and won an election last year, had been on an extended visit to Southeast Asia before he arrived in London to address the city ahead of his meeting with Mr. Johnson. At his presentation in Guildhall, Prime Minister Kishida said Japan's economy would continue to see robust growth and that its shift to an upgraded version of capitalism means that investors could back the powerhouse with confidence. He told the audience that his new economic policy is an upgraded form of capitalism in which public and private sectors work together. Japan is aiming to generate a virtuous circle of economic growth and redistribution of wealth under this agenda, bringing cautious Japanese firms under pressure to raise wages. Prime Minister Kishida acknowledged that his country would face labor challenges and says companies there need to become more diverse and that the government would introduce tax incentives to encourage the private sector to boost wages, and further R&D investment is needed to hit international levels. Like countries around the world, Japan has been hit by rising energy, food and living costs that have been exacerbated in recent months by a sharp decline in its yen currency and the war in Ukraine. A newly released United Nations report says countries around the world are likely to face even more severe food shortages in 2022, with the ongoing war in Ukraine set to have the biggest impact on lower-income countries. Secretary-General Antonio Guterres says in the report that the world faces an unprecedented hunger crisis, with food prices having never been higher and the lives and livelihoods of millions left hanging in the balance. Jointly issued by 17 agencies, including the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the report covers the food situation of 53 countries in 2021 and forecasts the situation in 2022 for 41 countries.
Or commodities coming out of Ukraine. There are commodities coming out of Russia, but they're coming out at a much higher cost. Now put yourself in a position where in a low-income country or lower middle-income country where you were, let's say, spending 50% of your income or more on food. And suddenly your food got more expensive. This is what we are seeing in many parts of the world as we speak.
And joining us for more on the programme, counter-terrorism expert and lawyer, Mr. John Essien, joins us from London, the UK. Thank you for joining us on the programme.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin with reports from earlier today. The Ukrainian commander leading troops holed up in the steel plant in Mariupol, saying that it is difficult, bloody battles are being fought at the Azovstal steel works, and saying that this is the last stronghold of resistance in Mariupol. What's your take? Do you think that Russia will succeed in this fight?
Well, it probably will, because while Russia has the weapons and the personnel, the Ukrainian soldiers who've been held up in the steel plants have not had any replenishments, not in personnel, not in food or water, not even in equipment, in lethal replenishment. So. And Russia wants to be able to at least secure this victory so it could celebrate it as a symbol for the commemoration of their winning of the Nazis in 1945 during the Second World War. So it'll be not just a symbolic loss, but a strategic one as well. But given the fact that they've been able to hold up Russian soldiers who would rather have been deployed to the east, to the Donbass, where there's a battle to secure the Donbass, the Ukrainian soldiers have been able to they've done exceedingly well to be able to hold them up here for the time they've held them up. So they've done brilliantly so far. But I think that in another couple of weeks, maybe less, that they'll be able to take Mariupol and then divide Ukraine, and that'll be sad.
What do you think this will do to President Zelensky and also especially the Ukrainian troops who are there in the front lines?
There'll be a loss of morale, but not for very long, because they know it's a short-term defeat. Besides, it's the defeat of a battle, not the war. That is just one battle. And but one of the things that will concern them is that is the elite of the Ukrainian forces. That's the very best. They are the most experienced, so it will be a loss to lose them, because the Russians will probably ensure that they'll kill rather than maybe capture them as prisoners of war. They'll probably almost certainly kill them, so that'll be sad as well. But from the beginning of this war, Russia had intended to take all of Ukraine. When that changed, they changed strategies and said that all they wanted was the Donbass, just to save face. But since the war began, there has been evidence of a lack of training of the soldiers, of strategic planning, of operational deployment and execution. Everything has gone wrong. And the command control decision-making capabilities have been compromised, which is why 12 of their generals have been killed. So a lot has gone wrong and will keep going wrong, because there's not, you need a lot of time, not even years, but decades, to resolve the problems that Russia has. So I think that the tacticians within the Ukrainian army know that this is just a loss, a temporary loss, that they'll regain Mariupol eventually.
Now, I think this happened earlier in the week, the latest decision by the EU on, phasing out Russian oil. I mean, this must be very significant in this war. And this is also saying as Gazprom is saying that it will be using Nord Stream 2 for Russia's domestic needs.
They had to come to that decision eventually. I think it was Germany and I think Slovakia and Hungary that were dragging their feet. But they had to come to a decision. It will have ramifications in the short term. But eventually, everyone has to tighten up their belts. Eventually, it'll help because they're looking to grind down Russia. They're looking to strategically weaken Russia so it's never able to have the audacity to attack any country the way it's done in Ukraine. But in order to do that, they have to make compromises as well. And if it's losing Russian oil and gas till the end of the year, then that is what it is. It's a far bigger gain taking Russia out than having to rely on Russian oil.
I want us to take a closer look at NATO and especially, its role in this invasion. Yesterday, we heard Germany saying it is supporting the move. It will support Finland and Sweden to join NATO. But doesn't this aggravate Russia? And this is especially where Germany is concerned. Russia's is its major supply of oil.
From the very beginning of this war, NATO had been treating it like an optional intervention. It didn't really want to aggravate Russia. And Russia is, because Russia knows how the West thinks. It's lived next to the West for years. It knows how it thinks. It's exploiting all of that to advance its agenda. So I think it's high time they make that move. They can do without Russia's oil. And if Finland expresses an intention and Sweden to join NATO, they should join NATO, because if they don't, then it'll just be giving Russia a launching pad. We cannot afford, the West cannot afford for a stalemate in this war. There has to be a decisive victory in Ukraine's interest, because then that protects Europe. So they have to, if it's Finland and Sweden joining NATO, then that is what it is. Russia was threatening that if they join NATO.
Sorry to interrupt, John. I was going to say that, I mean, is there a threat with, the moves Finland and Sweden are trying to make? Is there really a threat? And don't you think that, going forward with this would just worsen the relations?
There is a threat, but whether Russia doesn't really have any. If you've, I'm sure you've paid attention to this war since it began. Russia has done really badly. And it's really exposed itself because we had overestimated Russia. If the West had not overestimated Russia, this war would have been over ages ago. Now it's been exposed. We know its capabilities. We know it needs a lot of time to rebuild because Russia has lost more personnel in this war in 1 month than it did in 1 decade when it was in Afghanistan. And it's lost more equipment as well. So that just tells you the sorry state of Russia's army. All it has is nuclear weapons. It's not the only one with nuclear weapons, and it's threatening to position nuclear weapons along the borders in the Baltic states. If Sweden and what's the other country? If they join NATO, but he's had nuclear weapons in that area since 2016, and he had them upgraded in 2018. So now he's pretending he's never had. And the West knows as well that it already has nuclear weapons. If he threatens nuclear weapons, the West should make sure that he understands that the West has the capability, it has the political will to defend its allies and defend itself. If it ever tries using nuclear weapons, that is what he's going to get back. And as a matter of fact, that should not be the limit, because what the West usually does is say, if you attack me, then my response will be measured and proportionate. That is not sufficient, because that will go into his response calculus. He'll prepare for the measured and proportionate and use nuclear weapons anyway. So they have to go a step beyond that and say, we don't have to be measured, we don't have to be proportionate, but we'll respond. So you think through what you're doing before you do it.
But isn't the threat of nuclear weapons just, bluff, so to speak? Because, I mean, it would definitely affect everyone.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. We've had nuclear weapons since 1945, and it's never been used in all of that time for that precise reason, because it amounts to mutually assured destruction to anyone who uses it. And even if Russia were to use it, you can't silo the ramifications of a deployment or a discharge, because it'll affect even Russia as well. It'll affect its troops. It'll affect the Russian civilians. So he needs to think through all of this before he does anything silly. Besides, it's not just his decision. He has people he has to consult with, and I don't think they're stupid. So we should set aside that threat and be objective.
And the Kremlin has said that they think the U.S. is dragging Finland and Sweden into NATO. You might disagree or agree, but I'd like to ask, are there still neutral countries in Europe, or do you think that Europe has moved, from what it used to be to something else?
The only neutral countries in Europe are Austria, Ireland, Cyprus. I forgot the last one. There were 6. Well, there are still 6 since Finland and Sweden haven't joined yet. But when they join, then it will be just 4 left. But eventually, with what has happened, they'll all have to come into NATO. And I think that will really happen. Because after this war, Russia will not be much of a threat. Everyone can see that. So there shouldn't be any problem joining NATO.
We'd like to thank you. Mr. John Essen is a counter-terrorism expert joining us from London. Always a pleasure having you join us on the programme.
Thank you for having me.